Hello and welcome to Couple of Plants. I talk everything living soil, and today I've got another video prepared for you. I translated a German talk into English because I thought there might be some of you out there who will find it helpful or might benefit from it. I want to talk about watering living soil, what you actually need to pay attention to, and whether you need to actually adjust the pH value of your water before watering living soil. Okay, so I'll start talking about different types of water because there's actually a lot of different types of water to choose from with different properties. I'll be also talking about water quality, what you actually need to know to determine water quality. I'll also be explaining pH value and which kind of water or which values and properties are actually best when growing in living soil. Also, I'll be answering the question if you need to adjust the pH of your water when growing in living soil. I'll be also putting timestamps under the video so you can actually skip stuff if you already know some or you just need to know one or two things. Also in this talk I'll be showing you how to correctly water, what types of irrigation you can choose from, pros and cons there, and also I'll be talking shortly about overwatering, so you need to know what to look out for. First of all, talking about tap water, which is the most common household source, of course. It can be very hard, it can also be very soft, depends on where you're living, where you're coming from, which region you are from. That means it can also have different mineral ratios in there. And also it contains stuff like chlorines, chloramines, and fluoride to kill off stuff like germs and bacteria, which when growing in living soil can be very problematic. So if you want to use your tap water to grow in living soil, then you should let it stay for at least 12 to 24 hours before using it. Next up we got rainwater, often collected outside in the garden, less so indoors, obviously. It is usually low in nutrients and slightly acidic, so it virtually contains no minerals. Therefore it is very soft in most cases. Rainwater can contain pollutants, but basically, at least for plants, these are no issues at all. Then there's reverse osmosis water, or RO water. A lot of people also call it. RO water is produced through pressuring water or pushing water through a fine membrane, which filters out all the nutrients, minerals, and pollutants pretty effectively, actually. It also involves quite a bit of water, so which is the downside. There's quite a bit of wastewater. Well water is oftentimes pretty hard, so rich in calcium, but also here it varies quite a bit from the depth, the soil type, and where you're from. So to make sure you know what you're using, you should test your well water before using it for your plants or other stuff. Number 5, we got spring water. Spring water forms when groundwater naturally reaches the surface, so it gets really filtered quite a lot through all the different layers of rock. It can vary quite a bit as well in terms of mineral content, hardness and stuff. Usually it is quite good quality, but also here to make sure you should test it before using. Last but not least, we got distilled water or deionized water, which is obtained through distillation. It is therefore pretty pure, it is very soft, and it is basically free of any dissolved substances. So the pH, at least initially, is around 7, so it is neutral, but it becomes slightly acidic once it gets exposed to air. When growing in living soil or growing in generally, distilled water is pretty costly, so therefore most of the time I wouldn't recommend it. And we won't be spending much time talking about it here today. Alright, talking about water quality. The term water quality generally refers to the usability of water for human or natural purposes and processes, of all kinds. Accordingly, there's no universally applicable standard or index that can actually define water quality. I took that from German Wikipedia and translated it, but it basically means that water which is good for humans is not necessarily suitable for living soil. I'll also be talking about different myths and misunderstandings here today, which have developed in the living soil community, which I would also like to clarify. But first, we gotta take a look at water quality, what actually determines water quality. And first of all, we got the mineral content, we got the pH value, which indicates if the water is acidic, neutral, or alkaline. We got the conductivity, which basically measures the amount of dissolved salts and minerals inside the water. Also stuff like pollutants, contaminants, and the biological quality, so the amount of germs or bacteria and algae inside the water, as well as the sensory properties. pH value, on the other hand, pH standing for potential heterogeneity, or the strength of the hydrogen ions, shows how many hydrogen ions are actually inside the water. So if you measure the pH and you measure a lot of H plus ions, that means you got a low pH and acidic water. On the other hand, if you measure only a few H plus ions inside your water, that means your water is alkaline. Salts and minerals also do play a role here in terms of pH, because the more dissolved calcium, for example, there is inside the water, the harder it gets to move the pH value. So the more minerals inside the water, the more stable, the more fixed the pH gets. So, for example, if we got water with pH 8 with a lot of minerals, so hard water, and we want to reduce the pH of that water, we need a lot of acid to do so. If we, on the other hand, have pH 8 in soft water with only a few minerals or basically no minerals, then this water is pretty unstable. We can change the pH very easily by only taking a little bit of acid. So the technical term for this is carbonate hardness or buffering capacity. When growing in living soil, the water quality is the main and key factor here. So a lot of people go by pH value only, or maybe by the TDS, the dissolved solids. That's not what you should look out for. So if you really want to determine the water quality, you need to look at all the other parameters I just showed you to actually make sure you got good water. pH only plays a minor role here. So the question is, what water quality or which parameters actually are ideal when growing in living soil? And generally, very soft and pure water is preferred in most cases. So stuff like rainwater, RO water really is the ideal source when growing in living soil. But living soil really differs in composition and production from one supplier to another. So there are suppliers that actually recommend using tap water, for example. And here some opinions differ, and I want to clarify why that is. As I've stated before, living soil varies in composition and production from one supplier to another. So it can actually be that the different types of water, like very hard water or very soft water, can have different effects on your living soil depending on the mixture you got. For example, if you have a living soil which is very rich in calcium and also comes with a rather high initial pH, if you water with very hard tap water with a high pH, in that type of soil you get issues really quickly. Why is that? That's because you already pretty much have the limit. You've maxed out the limit in your soil. You already have enough calcium. The pH already is pretty high. If you put hard water on top of that, the calcium will accumulate in the soil and raise the pH further, and that means that certain nutrients can't be taken up anymore and you get a lot of different issues. On the other hand, if you would use the same hard tap water with a high pH on a soil that is relatively acidic and low in calcium, you obviously have a lot more buffer and a lot more time before the same problems occur. Now, what happens if the pH of the soil rises too high and you got a too high pH? That means that micronutrients like zinc, manganese, and iron can't be taken up from the plant anymore. So that leads to a sort of lockout. Even if you got these nutrients present in the soil, the plant can't take it up anymore. So the optimal soil pH should always be around 6.5, plus or minus a bit is okay, but if it goes too high or too low, you run into different issues. That also means that if you water and use water in your living soil, a pH of around 6 to 7, or basically the sweet spot 6.5, is ideal when watering in living soil. Now, there are some suppliers or companies that produce living soil that actually recommend watering with tap water, but the general principle I personally follow is the following: a good living soil, properly prepared with a balanced composition and sufficient amounts of individual components and nutrients, thrives best with water that is as pure as possible, with low levels of contaminants, pollutants, and minerals. Now, that does not automatically mean that the living soil mixes from companies that recommend using tap waters are bad per se. That's not true. All living soil mixes are different. There are stuff and ingredients like peat, for example, or other ingredients that can really acidify the soil over time, where it could make sense to counteract by using tap water. So some manufacturers try to take into account that a lot of people actually only have access to tap water, so they adjust their living soil mix accordingly, so you can use your tap water without any issues. That's a workable solution, but it is also a compromise. Because the issue with tap water I personally have is that the composition varies extremely from city to city. I've already explained earlier that also the mineral ratios always are different from town to town. So depending on the region, the ratio of calcium to magnesium and other minerals differ quite a bit. That means that tap water actually is not tailored to the needs of a cannabis plant. It is more so to be used as a source of drinking water, for cooking, for washing, and for showering, but not for growing living soil, in living soil, or for growing cannabis. So due to the highly variable amounts and ratios of mineral inside the tap water, it is fundamentally unsuitable to be used to, basically balance the nutrient needs of cannabis plants. So over time, if you use tap water, most likely certain substances will always be either too high or too low, which, especially when be used in long term, will sooner or later cause issues in your soil. Therefore, in most cases, all the missing minerals and nutrients in living soil should preferably be supplied in the form of a top dressing, mulch, or compost, or stuff like kitchen waste, like eggshells and stuff, as a form of solid additives. Ideally, especially if you grow in larger living soil beds or commercially, a soil analysis should be conducted in a laboratory to determine the requirement for individual components and to be able to adjust them accordingly. Now, in terms of my personal recommendation when growing with my personal regular living soil mix, I do recommend watering with RO water or rainwater. There are some situations where you could actually use stuff like CalMag, so basically instant available calcium and magnesium, to be used inside your water, which is when you actually grow in very small pot-sized containers or plants that are root-bound, and if you need very fast or quick access, or if there's an increased demand that can not otherwise be met. Now let's talk about some misunderstandings regarding reverse osmosis water. There are a lot of people online that claim that reverse osmosis water is fundamentally bad for living soil, arguing that the RO water actively pulls nutrients away from the soil. that's not that's not true, because like the reverse osmosis water does not actively pull away the nutrients from the soil. It is just low in salts, and because it is low in salts, it can take up the salts from the soil much quicker than basically tap water that comes with a lot of salts already. And due to this, it makes the plants, makes the salts that are in the soil and all the minerals in the soil plant available a bit quicker than tap water. So it's actually a good thing, but it doesn't drain it. The only thing is that if you use RO water or rainwater without any type of replenishment like top dresses or mulch, then in a closed loop system, over time you could actually deplete your soil by these minerals, but it's not because the RO water actively pulls it away, it's because they get used up by the plant. So nutrient leaching only really occurs if you water way too much, so you get drain, which is always a bad thing in living soil. You should not water by so you get drain and running out of your running out of your pot. Excuse me, a little hiccup there. But if you don't do that, then there's basically no way of leaching your soil. Now the question is, do you actually need to adjust the pH of your irrigation water when growing in living soil? And here too, it strongly depends on the situation. In general, if you use good water with a good water quality regarding cannabis, which means it is low in contaminants, it is low in minerals, stuff like RO water, rainwater, you don't have to adjust the pH. You also should not do it because the water is very soft, means it is very unstable, it has a low buffering capacity, and if you put acid in there, you will get a very low pH and huge pH swings, which is not a good thing. So if you use rainwater, reverse osmosis water and stuff, then don't adjust the pH. But if you use tap water, which is very hard and comes with a lot of calcium and magnesium and is high in pH, like pH 8 for example, then it can actually make sense to adjust the pH and lower it towards 6 or 6.5 to get inside that sweet spot I've talked about earlier when watering, because if you do that, then the microbes in the soil don't have to work as much to buffer the pH and can immediately be effective. But there's also different types of lowering the pH, and it matters how you do it and what you use to do so. First of all, talk about another misunderstanding inside the living soil scene or the watering scene, whatever. People oftentimes tell me that acid kills microbes, so you should not lower the pH or use any acid in your water because that acid would actually kill the microbes inside the soil. But acid, if you use it correctly, does not kill any microbes in your soil. If you, and that's the thing here, you really need to use it correctly. If you do so, then there is nothing that actually can happen because to explain it, if you use tap water, like I've mentioned before, there's a lot of carbonates in there, there's a lot of calcium and magnesium in there, and if you put acid on there to lower the pH towards 6.5, everything gets neutralized. So there's no acid left in the water. It interacts with all the carbonates, it neutralizes, and it's fine. But if you put too much acid in there and the pH is, let's say, 2 or 3, then of course you could cause damage with it. But as long as you stay in the ideal range, which is between 6 and 7 when growing in living soil, then you do not do any harm, and you can use it without having to think about it as much. So, as I've stated before, when you use rainwater or reverse osmosis water, you should not use acid because you get wild pH swings and a very unstable water source. But be careful, it also matters how and with what you lower your pH, because there are different types of acids. Commonly there's stuff like citric acid and phosphoric acid. Both of these act a little bit different. Of course, both are acids, so both lower the pH of your water, The citric acid reacts with the carbonates in the water and neutralizes them, as well as the phosphoric acid, but it does so in a different way. It leaves the calcium and magnesium plant available inside the water, so if you use citric acid on hard tap water and you lower the pH, all the magnesium and calcium gets immediately plant available and can be taken up by the plant, so that the carbonates don't have to be worked up by microbes in the soil, and can be taken up immediately, which can be a good thing if your plant is deficient in calcium or magnesium, for example, and you water with tap water and use some citric acid. The plant can actually immediately take up the calcium and magnesium, and you can work against the deficiency. On the other hand, if you have very, let's say, healthy plants, and you have more than enough calcium and magnesium in your soil, and you don't need to make the plant take up more acid and not more calcium and magnesium, then you could use phosphoric acid, because that reacts in a way that binds the calcium and the magnesium into calcium phosphate and magnesium phosphate, and the plant can't take up these. So they are not plant available, and they also settle on the bottom of your pot or your tank or your water tank, so the plant does not get access to these, but the pH gets also lowered. So there are two different types and different use cases, therefore. So if you want to actually help your plant to immediately get access to calcium and magnesium when using tap water, then citric acid is the way to go. If you do not want to use that, you don't need that, or you're working with, for example, a water tank where the water needs to be more stable, then phosphoric acid can actually be more useful, because it lowers the pH on a longer term basis. Citric acid only works temporary. It then interacts with all the air, and the pH slowly rises again. So, how do I water living soil correctly? What needs to be considered? Top priority when watering living soil is moisture consistency. Really the most important thing when growing in living soil. That means that maintaining the correct level of moisture is the highest priority. Microbes that work in the soil generally function best when moisture is kept at an optimal level and you don't get huge swings between wet and dry that then impair the performance of your microbes. Also, there are no reliable studies showing that drybacks in living soil actually offer any significant benefits. So you don't have to do drybacks like you do, or you would do when growing in with mineral fertilizer, for example, or stuff like rock wool and stuff. You don't have to do that in living soil. But drybacks can improve the aeration in the roots. So if you are waterlogged or you got root rot, then it could actually stimulate the soil life in a positive way to actually dry the living soil back a bit, to make it get access to oxygen and stuff. So also, side effect of this is that the roots, if you want to do that, grow actually deeper in the soil if there is not enough water, or if there's not too much water coming from above. Now the question is, how do I measure moisture correctly? And there are different types of devices you could use. The most common devices when growing in living soil are, first of all, the tensiometers, which is my personal favorite. They measure the water tension or the suction tension. They are available in mechanical and digital versions, and they show how hard the plants actually have to pull to absorb the water from the soil. So the higher the negative pressure, the drier the soil, and the more suction force the plant needs. Basically, they are very accurate devices, and I also recommend them in most cases. Another type or form of device is a device that measures moisture in percent, which actually indicates the proportion of the soil volume that is filled with water. So if the device measures 25%, that means that 1/4 of the soil volume consists of pure water. Now, which values are actually ideal when growing in living soil? What do we need to look out for? What are we aiming to to get. And when growing with 10 zeometers, then everything between 70 and 150 millibar is actually suitable. When you grow in my living soil, I can say that 90 to 110 millibar really is ideal. Try to not get above 300 millibar, as the soil life really can suffer. Also, everything below 70 or 50, especially over a longer period of time, meaning like 12 or 24 hours, can cause issues in terms of overwatering. Now, if you use meters that measure moisture in percent, then you generally aim between 30 and 40%. Some living soils like mine actually perform best between 25 and 30%. Everything between 20 and 30% is slightly dry, but really not problematic. Everything below 20%, on the other hand, really should be avoided because it reduces the microbial activity. Now, different types of irrigation also play a huge role. You could actually, of course, water by hand, which is doable, but especially in living soil where consistency is key, watering by hand really is prone to errors and most of the time reduces the overall effectiveness of your living soil. It does work, you can do it, of course, but if you want to really aim for the best, then watering by hand certainly is not the option. Drip irrigation we got here as well, which usually works with hoses or drippers that slowly release water directly into the surface of the soil. It is a very even distribution, it has low evaporation, and the soil life remains stable and the moisture level remains stable. So it is especially suitable when growing in living soil. Stuff like blue mud systems is a type of drip irrigation as well, where you use these small devices that actually use as a act as a dripper and have ceramic sensors in them that tell them once the soil is dry that the membrane opens up and water goes through, and if it's getting wet again, then it closes up and the dripper closes. So everything works without any electricity or any pumps and stuff, so you could pretty much use it anywhere as well. We also got stuff like soaker hoses or porous hoses. I personally do not recommend them as much because they can clog up, but I do know quite a bit of people that use these type of soaker hoses very successfully. Also, there's stuff like wick irrigation, also can work very well, but most of the time wick irrigation is better suited in small container sizes. If you have a large living soil bed, it is very unpractical to actually install and use a wick irrigation. Last but not least, we got autopot, which is also a passive form of bottom watering. You don't need any electricity or pumps. A lot of people use autopots, so maybe you already know it. When the tray is empty, there's a valve that opens up and allows new water to actually flow back. So the plants basically feed themselves as well. The challenges with autopots is that oftentimes the soil is too moist or too wet in the beginning. That means young plants and seedlings should not be connected or watered by the autopot system. You should wait for a couple of weeks until the plant really has rooted into the pot and is bigger and can actually take up a lot of moisture or water, and then you can actually use the autopots with no issues. So, if you water by hand, I got some tips for you. Especially if you grow in living soil, then you should avoid watering with too big amounts of water. As I've explained before, huge swings from wet to dry are a really bad thing because the microbes can't work, and that affects the performance of your soil, and therefore it affects the performance of your plant. So water at maximum like 5% per watering, and if the plant or the soil dries out quickly, then just increase the frequency of your waterings rather than the amount of your watering. So also try to use measuring devices. If you do not have money or you can't use any measuring devices and you grow in pots, check the pot weight after and before watering to get a grip and to get a feeling where the optimal weight is to keep your plant happy. And now looking at overwatering, I've attached like two common pictures here from the internet that show an overwatered plant or overwatered plants. Typically the leaves hang limp downward and the leaves also slightly curl downward. You got slow growth and you got waterlogging inside the substrate. Leaves remain limp even after you water your plants. So that's some really important points to take into consideration if you have the feeling that you overwatered your plants. Take a look at these pictures, take a look at these symptoms, and you probably really quickly will understand if your plant is overwatered or not. If you use My Living Soil, I've made a separate video on my German channel. Overwatering symptoms can be a bit different. Plants in My Living Soil often droop less, and the leaves are also not as limp as in the pictures before. But due to the high amounts of calcium and magnesium that gets dissolved into the water, you get brown tips and brown edges because different salts get taken up too much and other nutrients get locked out. So it looks a little bit like nutrient burn or some potassium deficiency, which isn't the case because there's no inside the soil, but as I've stated, because the plant or the soil is overwatered. That's it for today. I hope I've answered all your questions. Maybe there's somebody out there that actually benefits from it. I would be happy if that's the case. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to let me know. Leave a comment down below. And if you liked it, leave a like. I hope I see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.